Johnny Cash finished the last note of Folsom Prison Blues and let it hang just long enough to feel intentional. He set the guitar back onto its stand and stepped away. The audience at NBC Burbank applauded automatically, trained by years of television rhythm to respond on cue. Dean Martin moved in with the ease that had carried him through thousands of transitions. The grin was already there, loose and familiar, calibrated to carry the show from music into conversation. The next segment depended on that moment. It always did. Cash didn't reach for his cue. For 3 seconds, he looked at Dean without speaking. Not long enough to provoke laughter, too long to be part of the plan. Then he turned, walked past the microphone, and left the stage without a word. The applause thinned, then stopped. Dean's smile stayed in place, but his eyes followed Cash toward the wings. The floor director cut a hand across his throat. A voice rose in the control booth. This was a live taping with a full audience, and Johnny Cash had just stepped out of the frame. 3 hours earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Cash had arrived at the studio for rehearsal because Dean Martin had asked him personally. Not through a manager, not through the network. Dean had called his hotel room in Los Angeles and told him he wanted to do something different that night. Not just a song, a conversation. He wanted Cash to talk about the prison concerts, about Folsom, about San Quentin, about the men Cash had met inside places most Americans preferred not to imagine. Dean didn't ask for jokes. He didn't ask for controversy. He asked for honesty. Cash agreed because the request wasn't dressed up as television. It sounded like a promise. The rehearsal went exactly as planned. Cash played the song. Then he sat down for a 7-minute segment that had been carefully timed but loosely structured. Dean would ask, Cash answer in his own words. Dean had insisted on that. He didn't want a script. At 4:30 p.m., an NBC executive walked into Cash's dressing room without knocking. Cash was adjusting his tie in the mirror. June Carter sat nearby, flipping through a magazine. "We've made a small adjustment to tonight's format," the executive said. Cash turned around. "What kind of adjustment?" "The prison segment. We're cutting it." June looked up. Cash didn't react immediately. "Cutting it. We're replacing it with a duet. You and Dean. The audience will love it." "We rehearsed the segment this afternoon." "I understand, but Standards has concerns. Sponsors too." The executive kept his tone even. "Some of the language about the correctional system, it's not appropriate for a variety program." "What language?" The executive pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "You planned to say the system is designed to break men, not rehabilitate them, that people throw inmates away and pretend they don't exist." And in that moment, while Christmas Eve held its breath, the plan everyone agreed on stopped mattering. The order hadn't come from panic. That was the part no one outside the room would ever understand. Every voice shouting, "Pull them out," carried the weight of calculations already completed. Fuel margins shrinking, air support drifting out of alignment, weather fronts moving faster than forecasts had promised. Christmas Eve didn't pause operations, and it didn't forgive mistakes. It only made them colder. The team on the ground wasn't just exposed, they were boxed in. Terrain that looked manageable on satellite feeds turned brutal at eye level. Narrow approaches, no clean extraction path. Every second spent debating increased the risk of losing more than the original target. Command had seen this pattern before, too many times. This wasn't cowardice, it was containment. One of the senior officers leaned over the map, finger tracing the perimeter where options had quietly died. He wasn't shouting anymore. His voice dropped into something flatter, more dangerous. The tone people use when they've already accepted loss and are trying to limit how much of it spreads. "We wait any longer, we lose the asset too." No one argued, because it was true. Pulling them out didn't mean abandoning them emotionally. It meant acknowledging the moment had slipped past the point where heroics helped. It meant refusing to turn one impossible situation into two. Every doctrine, every after-action report written in blood pointed toward the same decision: abort, regroup, live to act again. Outside the command space, the cold deepened. Batteries drained faster. Metal stiffened. Radios lost clarity. Christmas Eve wasn't symbolic here, it was operational. Fewer rotations, slower response windows, less room for error. The kind of night where bad decisions multiplied quietly. Someone called out the time since last contact. Another confirmed degradation in signal quality. The room absorbed it without reaction. These were expected failures, already accounted for. This was the part of the story where everyone was supposed to agree, and most of them did. The room began to move as one, not frantically, efficiently. Procedures kicked in, assets were reassigned, a controlled withdrawal plan unfolded, step by step, like something rehearsed too often to feel dramatic anymore. It wasn't cruel, it was practiced. She watched it happen from the edge. She understood exactly why the order had been given, understood the responsibility pressing down on the people issuing it. They weren't villains, they were people trying to prevent the situation from cascading beyond control. If she had been looking at the data everyone else was focused on, she would have agreed with them. That was what made the decision dangerous, because the system wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. She didn't see hope where others saw desperation. She saw timing, a fracture between variables that hadn't aligned yet, a narrow corridor the models dismissed because it didn't last long enough to be useful on paper.
I sang the song, Cash said. That's what I agreed to. Dean took a step closer. You know what they're going to say, that you walked, that you embarrassed me. I didn't walk, Cash replied. I stopped. Before Dean could answer, a voice cut in from behind them. Mr. Martin, Mr. Cash. Porter Whitman was there now, flanked by two men in suits who didn't bother to introduce themselves. Whitman's face was tight, his voice sharp with urgency. Mr. Cash, you're in breach of contract. If you don't return to the stage immediately, NBC will pursue damages. Cash didn't react. Dean turned toward Whitman. Give us a minute. We don't have a minute, Whitman snapped. We have cameras rolling and an audience waiting. Dean's tone hardened. I said, give us a minute. Whitman stared at him, then looked past him toward the stage, calculating. Finally, he nodded once and stepped back, motioning the others away. The hallway went quiet again. You think I wanted to cut that segment? Dean asked, his voice lower now. You think I don't know exactly why they did it? I approved it, Cash said. I approved it because if I didn't, they would have done it anyway, and you wouldn't even be standing here right now. They'd swap you out and keep rolling. That's the difference between us, Dean replied. You think being there is the same as being heard. Dean laughed once without humor. You don't get to pretend you're protected. You walk away from this, you lose an appearance. I fight them, I lose the show. Then don't fight them, Cash said. Dean stopped. That's not what you mean. I'm not asking you to do anything. Dean looked at him. You're standing here making it impossible for me not to. Whitman's voice echoed from the stage entrance. Dean, now. Dean didn't turn. He looked at Cash for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of him was being rigid or honest. If I go back out there, Dean said slowly, they'll finish the show without you. They'll tell the audience there was a technical problem. Tomorrow they'll say you were difficult. That's their job, Cash replied. Mine is to keep my word. To who? To the men I said I'd speak for. Dean shook his head. You're asking me to burn everything down for a principle you don't have to live with afterward. Cash met his eyes. I live with it every day. Dean turned and walked halfway back towards the stage. He stopped, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared. From where Cash stood, he could see the edge of the light spill onto the floor. Whitman reappeared. Dean, make a decision.
Dean looked at the cameras, then back at the wings. "Shut it down," he said. Whitman stared. "You can't do that." "I just did." There was a pause. Then Whitman's voice dropped. "If you walk away from this, there will be consequences."
Dean nodded once. "I'm aware." Whitman turned to the crew. "Cut power, clear the audience. Tell them there's a technical issue." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Cameras powered down. Stagehands moved. A production assistant hurried toward the audience with a rehearsed apology. Within minutes, the studio was empty. Dean stood in the hallway, staring at the floor. Cash waited a few steps away. Neither spoke. "You got what you wanted," Dean said finally. "I didn't want this," Cash replied. Dean laughed softly. "You wanted me to choose." Cash didn't answer. Dean lifted his head. "I knew they were going to cut it. They told me days ago. I didn't tell you because I thought if I could just get you here, get you on stage, it wouldn't matter." "It mattered," Cash said. Dean nodded. "Yeah, it did." He turned and walked away. Cash and June left through the back exit. In the parking lot, assistants were already on phones, voices low, words traveling faster than explanations. By the time they drove off, the story had started to move on its own. No one knew yet what it would become. The days that followed did not arrive with announcements. They came quietly, through missed calls and messages left unanswered. Assistants spoke in careful language. Schedules shifted without explanation. Nothing was framed as a response to what had happened. That, too, was deliberate. Dean Martin stayed out of view for a time. When he appeared, he kept his remarks brief and familiar the way he always had. When asked about the interrupted taping, he redirected the question with practiced ease. He had built a career on making deflections sound effortless. This time, it required more attention. Johnny Cash returned to his commitments. He went where he had already agreed to go. He sang where he was expected to sing. He didn't address the night from the stage. When someone asked him directly why he had stopped the show, he answered simply that he had done what he said he would do, nothing more. The response disappointed those who wanted a statement. It suited him. Inside the industry, the story began to separate into versions. One described a difficult guest. Another pointed to a host who had lost control of his own program. A third dismissed the entire thing as an overreaction. None of the accounts carried enough weight to erase the others. What traveled more quietly were the adjustments, the way conversations slowed when certain topics came up, the way plans were reconsidered before being spoken aloud. People remembered, if only briefly, that control could shift without warning. Dean and Cash did not speak for some time. When they did, the conversation avoided the night itself. There was no tally of fault, no attempt to resolve what had already passed. They spoke instead about work, about places they had been, about people they both knew. The space between them remained, present but unaddressed. Dean understood something then. That charm had always helped him avoid. There were moments when easing tension only postponed it. Cash understood something too, that silence, when used deliberately, carried a cost not everyone could afford to pay. Neither man treated the consequences as abstract. Dean returned to performing more frequently in live settings. The rooms varied. The conditions were simpler. There were fewer people listening in. When he spoke about honesty, it no longer sounded like a line delivered for effect. Some noticed the difference, others didn't. That was acceptable. Cash continued visiting prisons. The work remained steady. If anything, it grew quieter. He let the songs do the speaking. He avoided explanation when he could. The men he played for did not ask why he had left a television stage early. They already understood what it meant to be heard and ignored at the same time. The segment that had been planned was never shown.
It existed only as an outline that had not survived the evening. No recording circulated, no official reference was made. The absence settled into the background where many such things ended up. Years later, the night surfaced occasionally in conversation, usually as a reminder of how quickly plans could change, of how easily intention could be reshaped once it entered a controlled space. People talked about it as a story about television. It wasn't. It was about an agreement made privately and altered without warning, about the difference between remaining visible and remaining true, about how easily a plan could continue after its purpose had been removed. Cash never described the decision as clean. He admitted once that the result had been heavier than he expected. He didn't speak of it as a victory. He spoke of it as something he had accepted. Dean, for his part, did not frame the moment as a turning point. He acknowledged only that delaying a choice had its own weight, that hoping a situation would resolve itself was still a form of decision. What lingered was not the image of a show stopping mid-performance. It was the quieter recognition that once control is tested, it doesn't always return in the same shape. That integrity is not demonstrated by what is said when the room is full, but by what someone is willing to stand behind when the room empties. The question that remained was never whether Johnny Cash had been right to stop. It was whether continuing would have been easier, and what that ease would have required, and whether the difference matters when the lights are down, the audience has gone home, and the only people left to answer are the ones who chose.